In this lecture, we're going to talk about the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So we'll go to the board here. So 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and if Paul wrote these, and there's much division among scholars as to whether or not Paul is the actual author. But if Paul wrote these, then that means that he was released from his Roman imprisonment at the end of Acts. And so that would have been somewhere around 62 or 63. And Paul would have actually gone on that 4th missionary journey to take the gospel to Spain. And if he went on that journey, then he probably wrote 1st Timothy and Titus somewhere around 63 or 64. So he gets released from his Roman imprisonment somewhere around 62, 63. And then from there, he begins his journey towards Spain. And he is going to, or at least getting resources together to make that journey. And he is going to write 1st Timothy and Titus. We think Timothy is in the area of Philippi and Titus is on the island of Crete. And so Paul is writing them with instructions about how to deal with the churches and the leadership that is under their care that they're responsible for. Then Paul will get arrested and return to Rome. And so somewhere around 67 or 68, he will write 2nd Timothy as his last letter. So if Paul is the writer of these letters, then the date for their writing would be somewhere between 63 to 68 for all three. Now, if someone is writing in the name of Paul, if it's a pseudonymous letter to where they're claiming to be Paul, but they're not, but they're claiming Paul's authority, then the thinking is the date is somewhere around 110 and that it's early 2nd century. And here are the reasons why there is debate as to did Paul write these, mid-60s, or are these from a later time period, early 2nd century, somebody claiming to be Paul, but they're not, but they're writing kind of, channeling Paul, if you will. So here are the issues. So there is a line that shows up 5 times in the pastoral epistles. Here is a trustworthy saying. Okay, nowhere in Paul's other writings does he use that line. And so this is a line that is unique to the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And so the question is, okay, how does this show up 5 times in these 3 letters, whereas in the other 10 letters, it's not used at all? And some would say this is an indicator that we have a different author. And others would say, no, you can explain that away pretty easily. Our vocabulary, our phrases, our slogans, they change over time. And so it's not too difficult to think, okay, Paul's picked up a new saying and he's used it, 5 times in these 3 letters, and on we go. Okay, and I just challenge you to think how much has your vocabulary changed over the past, say, 5 years. And especially those of you who have lived someplace else and then you moved to campus. How did being on campus change your vocabulary? What slogans did maybe, or words did you pick up that maybe you weren't using back home? Or what slogans or phrases from back home did you bring? And now all of a sudden your roommate starts to talk like you and use those same phrases and slogans. Okay, so to be human is to have a language that develops, that grows, that changes. And so maybe it's an indicator of a new writer, but maybe it's just an indicator that Paul really is human and he picks up new phrases, new lines, etc. Another issue, church structure. So some argue that because in the pastoral epistles we see more church structure, that there are overseers or bishops, that there are deacons, and that there's actually a role that widows are placed on to be cared for, that this organization level shows that we're in a later time period, early 2nd century, and not during Paul's life. Okay, but nobody questions that Philippians is a genuine letter from Paul, and yet Paul speaks to the overseers and the deacons at the church of Philippi. And so already in Paul's lifetime, in his letter to the church of Philippi, we see that structure is beginning to take place. And so, again, you got two sides to it. That no, we don't see a lot of talk about overseers and deacons and the widow's role in his other letters, but at the same time, it's not unthinkable, especially when we read Philippians and also some of what he says in his other letters. I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, issues with, should somebody remain a widow or should they marry? It's not too difficult to imagine that the church is growing and becoming more structured, and that we don't have to wait until the early second century before we get this structured, because we see Philippians, the church of Philippi, a lot like this already. So again, kind of take your pick. The word godliness. So the word godliness shows up often in the pastoral epistles to describe the character of one who is living the Christian life. This word does not show up in Paul's other letters. And so godliness is used in the pastoral epistles, but it's not used in Paul's other letters. And so is this an indicator that there is a new author that's not Paul? Or is this an indicator that Paul picked up a new phrase? By the way, it does make me wonder that if I'm intentionally setting out to write in the name of Paul, I would think I would know Paul well enough that I wouldn't toss in a new word, okay, that doesn't show up in any of Paul's other letters. So if I'm trying to fake it, if you will, I'm not doing a super good job of disguising myself as Paul if I'm using, vocabulary and phrases that Paul doesn't use. I don't know. You can kind of weigh that one out. But again, scholars are divided. Some say, yeah, this is a second century word to talk about Christian life. And others would say, well, Paul has a growing vocabulary just like you and I do. And that this does not indicate that we have a new writer, just that we have a writer who uses new phrases, new terminology to talk about, the Christian life. Okay, another issue, the word faith or the concept faith. So in Paul's other letters, faith tends to point us in the direction of kind of a vibrant, trusting relationship. And so faith kind of carries with it the emphasis on trust, the dynamic relationship. Whereas in the pastoral epistles, the focus is more on correct doctrine, so the content of your faith. So instead of a trusting dynamic relationship, it's more the content of what you believe, the content of your faith. And so there's a heavy emphasis on the pastoral epistles on correct doctrine. Now, again, I don't know if that tips the scales to where, okay, because faith is used differently, kind of emphasizing content instead of trust, and there's such a heavy emphasis on correct belief or correct doctrine, does that mean we're in a later time period and that we have a different writer? I'm not sure I'm ready to go there. In Paul's other letters, sometimes faith is used in such a way that it does kind of lean into content. And his other letters are definitely concerned with correct belief. If we look at Ephesians, if we look at Colossians, if we look at Romans, we see that there is very much concern about believing rightly as well as living rightly, about, correct faith as well as, proper faithing, if we want to say it that way. So again, I don't know that this fully tips the scales that, we got to be coming from a later time period. In 1 Timothy 6:20, there's a warning against what is supposedly knowledge or so-called knowledge. And we think that this knowledge is some form of Gnosticism. Okay, Gnosticism is the belief that we are saved through enlightenment rather than saved from sin by the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so in Gnostic thought, it's kind of like every person has a spark of divinity in them in some kind of way, and that the body is this prison that makes us ignorant of our true identity. And through enlightenment, usually some particular teacher, whether it's Jesus or one of his apostles, that through enlightenment, we come to this recognition of who we truly are, that we truly are kind of divine, trapped in a human fleshly body, and we need to be set free. And so we're kind of enlightened as to our true identity. And the goal is for the soul, if you will, to return to divinity and be lost in divinity. And so instead of maintaining your personal identity as you would in Christian faith, you lose your identity, kind of like a drop of water loses its identity when it's in the ocean. You know, it returns to the ocean and it just becomes ocean and is no longer a particular drop with its own identity. Okay, and so that's kind of Gnostic thought, and Jesus is presented as kind of an enlightener, and through the enlightening teaching of Jesus and those he revealed his enlightenment to, you can be reunited with the divine. Okay, and the body's evil. So anyway, some would see that this is, this so-called knowledge, perhaps it's an early form of Gnosticism, and Gnosticism becomes full-blown in the early second century. So around 110, 120, that's when you have Gnosticism really kind of taking root and being a full-blown system of thought that people, kind of buy into. And it gets kind of wedded, if you will, with Christianity. And so you end up with some Gnostic Christians it's very unorthodox. And so the death of Jesus is meaningless, and no belief really in the resurrection of the body. That's all about kind of escaping this world. So don't have time to go into all of that now, but some would say, because we have this reference to what is false knowledge or so-called knowledge, that's Gnosticism. And so that would push us into, early second century, 110 or so. And that's the evidence that it's not from Paul. Okay, but others are going to push back against that and say, well, wait a minute. If Gnosticism is full blown by the early second century, then there has to be incipient forms of it in the first century. And so might it be that Gnosticism is already kind of beginning to develop during Paul's lifetime in the mid-60s, and that it becomes full-blown in the early second century, but it would have taken some time for it to kind of grow and to develop. And so already the seeds of it are planted, and Paul has had contact with that. And so he is warning, Timothy against it, and Titus to be on the watch for it. So those are kind of your main arguments, and you can kind of see how you can play either side and make a pretty good case. The other one, that's a big one, is the attitude towards women. And this passage, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, that women are not allowed to teach men. And so that becomes, for many, kind of the deal breaker. Okay, this cannot be Paul, because it doesn't fit with what Paul has written elsewhere. And so it must come from somebody else, must come from later. Okay, but I'm not sure that that really is the deal breaker that it looks like. And what we do see in the pastoral epistles themselves is that in 2 Timothy 4:19, Paul is going to greet Priscilla and Aquila. Now, this probably doesn't sound like much to you, but it's a pretty big deal. So you would never greet the wife before the husband unless the wife was somehow more important, carried more authority, had more status. But normally, you would always greet husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. And there is no way that somebody who believes that women should not be allowed to teach and have authority over men in all circumstances, all contexts, there's no way that person is going to greet the wife first. And so even within, the pastoral epistles, we see that you just can't take, this passage completely lifted out of context as if this is the attitude towards women, and therefore it can't come from Paul, when in 2 Timothy, he's going to greet the wife ahead of the husband. You just don't do that. Okay, if you buy into women can't have any type of authority over men, there's no way you're going to greet the wife first. So all this to say, well, I guess a couple things. So number one, what I kind of have sensed is that when it comes to the pastoral epistles, there is a tendency to land where you start. That a scholar who already is kind of skeptical of Pauline authorship and skeptical of the authority of the pastoral epistles, the place where they start from, they're going to end up with, Paul not writing them, that they're going to be a product of the 2nd century, where somebody is writing pseudonymously in the name of Paul as if they were Paul. Now, it's true that sometimes there is pseudonymous writing, but typically it's not in the name of somebody that immediately preceded you. Usually you go back generations, hundreds of years, thousands of years. You don't go back 50 years. Somebody might know that person and, you'd be called out. So pseudonymous writing, in the name of someone that, died 50 years earlier, that's kind of unusual. And so, but if you're kind of skeptical about tradition, about Paul, about what's going on here, then you kind of land there, that this must be a pseudonymous writing coming from around 110, 120, early 2nd century. And those who believe that it comes from Paul, more inclined to kind of a traditional understanding of it, then they're going to land where they start. And they're going to say, oh, yeah, Paul had a developing vocabulary. The church was becoming more structured, that type of thing. And so, you kind of end up, at least from what I've seen, kind of end up landing where you start. At least those who have studied it and form an opinion about it, they tend to reinforce the opinion. Probably when I was first introduced to the issue, maybe I'm going to undo what I just said. Growing up, I would have been inclined towards Paul. And then when I was first introduced to the issue, now all of a sudden it's kind of hanging up there and kind of in suspension and looking at these arguments. Oh yeah, maybe it did come from later. But the more I've kind of wrestled with it, the more I've thought about it, the more I've kind of swung back in the direction that no, I'm pretty sure that Paul wrote these. And maybe it's not something I'm going to die over, but if you would ask me today, or maybe you are asking me today, what position do I take? I'm going to go that Paul is the writer, and that I think these things are kind of explainable and still have Paul as the author. And then the question might be, well, what about the thing with women? I mean, that seems to be the deal breaker. I'd say, well, we need to slow down here. And I'm going to share an article with you, or an essay that I wrote, and make that available to you. But let me just sum up a couple things here. Paul's attitude towards women in ministry is that women can teach, and women can preach, and women can be co-laborers of the gospel. And we see this in his letters. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we have Paul admonishing women, and maybe their wives in particular, that they can pray and prophesy in the church service. They just need to do it with their heads covered, which is kind of a sign of authority, likely that you're married. And so you can pray and prophesy, but keep your wedding ring on. Okay, don't act like you're angelic now and you're not married to anyone. No, you're still in this world. You're still here. You're still, a wife. You're still married. And so, that sign that you're married, in our day, it's a wedding ring. For them and their time, part of that was a head covering. And so women, keep your heads covered as you pray and as you prophesy. And he's not talking about a women's Bible study. It's the church at worship. And so he doesn't silence them. He doesn't tell them that they can't teach, that they can't pray, that they can't prophesy, that they can't have a word for the people. No, you just need to do it, with your head covered. And I'm assuming, indicating that you are married, that you're not in some type of angelic state where you're no longer married. Okay, so, but women can pray and prophesy and teach and have authority. And he sends his letters with women. And so the one who brought Romans to the church at Rome was a woman. Her name was Phoebe. And probably she was more than just a courier. Probably she's the first person to teach Romans, to preach Romans, to explain Romans. And Paul evidently, obviously trusted her that she would be a good representation of him in terms of delivering this letter and helping the churches at Rome to understand the contents of it. And so here in the pastoral epistles, I think that we see the same person writing because he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila. So he's got to recognize that women can be in a more prominent role within the church, wives in a more prominent role than their husbands, that women don't simply take a backseat to men. So then what do we do? Well, probably there's a very complex context going on here. And I write about this in my essay that I'm going to share with you. But probably that context is the early form of Gnosticism. And in Gnostic thought, it was pretty messed up when it came to, messed up from an Orthodox perspective, from a Christian perspective. It was pretty messed up in terms of its understanding of creation and its understanding of the fall. And if you look at Gnostic documents like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, what we see there is that they have a completely different understanding of the creation of male and female. So in Genesis 2, the male is created first, and God says it's not good for the male to be alone, so I'm going to create a suitable helper for him. By the way, helper is not a diminutive term, that throughout the Old Testament, God is the helper. So for the woman to be called helper does not diminish her, somehow make her less than the male, okay? Because God is the helper. So this is a term that's used of God. So not good for the male to be alone, the man to be alone. So I'm going to create a suitable helper for him. And the way that God does that is he takes a rib from the side of the man and builds that rib into a woman and then presents the woman to the man. And the man says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, for she was taken from my side, taken from the side. And then you have marriage take place. And so the way that woman was created was the male first, and then the woman from the man, and then presented to the man. Okay, in Gnostic thought, you don't have male and female to start with. In Gnostic thought, you have an androgynous Adam, okay, a human being that doesn't have gender. And then what happens is that God takes this human being, and in Gnostic thought, this is a horrible mistake, that God takes this human being and God splits the human being so that now you have male and female. And furthermore, Gnosticism believes in the pre-existence of the soul. In other words, that the person isn't truly created at when conception takes place, that you have a soul that's kind of this complete being that's out there in eternity. And then what happens at birth is that soul gets split. Or what happens in conception is that soul that's out there gets split so that you have half the soul still kind of out there in eternity, and the other half gets encased or trapped in flesh. And there's gender. And so you're either trapped in a male body or you're trapped in a female body, while your counterpart is out there in eternity, and you're so entrapped that you're ignorant that you even have a counterpart, but you just have this desire for union. Okay, and this is Gnostic thought. And so Gnostic thought believes that gender comes about because the soul, the Adam, the androgynous being, was split. And now you have male and female. And furthermore, in Gnostic thought, this is where death enters the world. So death enters the world with the splitting of the Adam and being encased, half of the Adam being encased in a body that's corrupt and is going to die. Whereas in Christian thought, biblical thought, the way that death comes about is because of sin. And so we have the story of the fall in Genesis 3. So death comes about because of sin, not because God made a mistake and split the Adam and encased half of the Adam, in a male or female body that's going to die because it's corrupt, because it's temporary, because it's flesh. So what Paul is doing in these verses is basically rehearsing the Genesis account of creation and fall and the hope of salvation. And so I'll let you read the essay that I wrote. I won't continue to try to go into it here, but just to realize that this is a very complex context and that Paul's not writing a blanket statement for all times, all places. I don't permit women to teach men or to exercise any kind of authority over men. That just doesn't fit with Paul's writings, and it doesn't fit with 2 Timothy 4:19, greet Priscilla and Aquila, and it really doesn't fit with the rest of the New Testament. And so I challenge you, encourage you to read the essay, but to not let this be, what kind of tips you, that can't come from Paul. I think there's a way to work with it. But we have to realize that the context is complex. To oversimplify it, it'd be like if there was a group of, let's say there was a group of, how should we put it? Let's say there was a group of elderly men. Maybe I don't want to say elderly. Let's say at my church, there's a group of men, that are, in their 60s. Okay. And I tell that group of men in their 60s, hey, you guys are disrupting the service. You guys need to be quiet. Save it for later. You can't talk. Okay, well, if I'm taken out of context, it sounds like I just shut down a group of people, a demographic of people, in the church, and they're not allowed to participate. Okay, but everybody who's there knows that I didn't just shut them down and that they can't participate. Everybody who's there knows that I was trying to shut down the interruption, shut down the distractions. Okay, but I haven't shut them off from participating in the service in terms of prayer requests, testimony, whatnot. Okay, but words taken out of context can sound one way when everyone in the context understands what I'm doing. Okay, likely the same type of thing here, that Paul is saying something that everybody there who's reading it, they get it, they know the context, and they know what's going on. And now, centuries later, we don't have detailed insight into that context. We can work to try to reconstruct it, but we can't put the whole thing together. But now those words can get taken out of context, and so that women aren't allowed to preach. Okay, so I tell you all this really for three main reasons. One, I don't know how many of you gals may be sensing a call to ministry and a call to even a preaching and teaching ministry and exercise leadership. And somebody is throwing at you, these lines from Paul in 1 Timothy 2, saying, no, you're wrong about your calling. God doesn't call women to preach or to teach or to have leadership in the church. And so you end up being discouraged about your calling, and you never answer. You never say, yes, Lord, and go for it. And so I hope to set you free to be able to answer your calling. And I hope to be able to set, you guys free, you males free, you men, so that you can listen and learn and glean from women preachers and teachers and women in leadership that God does call, and you can't use this against them. And then third, one of the things I've seen over the years is at times women can be the most anti-woman in terms of teaching and preaching and leadership in the church. And so not only do I hope to set, the guys free, but also the gals free to receive preaching, teaching, leadership from women within the church. So I really do encourage you to read the essay. And if you have questions, feel free to email me about it, or we can talk about it if you want to set up a Zoom chat. But pretty important issue, and I'd hate for these words that are in a very specific context to kind of get between them and the Lord in terms of being able to answer your call and allow God to do in you and through you all that God desires to do. All right, so that's our lesson on the pastorals, and we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to begin to think a little bit about James and First Peter. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you for tuning in.